Hello and welcome to episode 8 of Mjolnir and the Movies. I'm David Yorkshire, editor of Mjolnir magazine, and with me, as ever, is composer and independent filmmaker Neil Westwood.
Hello.
And with us, we have James, who you may know from the comment section of YouTube as Bevel E. And he's quite a film buff, so he's here to help us out. Hello to you, James.
Hello.
Now this week we have a treat in store as we're looking at one of my favourite films, and I think one of the favourite films of everybody here, isn't it? Which is John Boorman's spectacular treatment of the Arthurian legend Excalibur. And I think we're all agreed here that it's an absolute classic. Now, the Arthurian epic has been written and rewritten and reinterpreted countless times over the centuries. So perhaps we can look at how this version fits into the canon and how it is specific to its own time as well as for all time, because great art should be created both for its own time and for all time, and what makes it so special. So I don't know who wants to start.
Well, I think this movie is standout from all the other mythology-based movies in that not many of the actors in the film are all that special or big nowadays. You can watch the film and think that you've seen a group of people who could be anybody, and they were in this one movie only. And it kind of makes it special and more personal to you, in that you don't see any of the celebrities in the magazine covers or as any other big movie stars. It's almost like it's a personal movie to you.
That's very interesting that you say that, because you have some people who are extremely famous now. Liam Neeson, for example, Patrick Stewart, Gabriel Byrne.
I suppose there's that, but a few of them never really went on to do anything after that. The guy who plays Arthur, for example, I don't think he was in many other movies after that. And I think the guy who played Lancelot, he died just like a few years after that. So none of these people became legends, and it never tainted the movie. It doesn't feel like a tainted movie.
Yeah, I think the film itself feels almost like a capsule on its own. The style of it, the way it's produced and the actors, so even the way the story develops, it doesn't feel like it's just following the tropes of Hollywood and plugged in a King Arthur story to it. It's very much its own thing.
Yeah, compared to the one that came out recently with the guy from Sons of Anarchy, I mean, that was an absolute mess. It just felt like a fashion show.
Or with Keira Knightley, half the time in war paint.
Yeah, things like that, just like over amplified. What is with British natives in blue paint? They pushed that all on us in the 90s and early 2000s. Historical Brits were seen as these warlike barbarians who painted themselves blue and just screamed and ran into the battlefield. Almost animalized us in a way.
And there's the choice with the new ones to tend towards this gritty realism, which has become quite a fashion. And of course you see that with the Keira Knightley era one, was it 2004? So it's not like it's an absolutely recent thing, but there's been a trend towards this supposed realism, which we know is total fantasy anyway. While Excalibur goes the opposite way. It says it knows what realism is. It's not like they can't look out a window and see what real life is. They've chosen not to portray real life. They want to choose to portray something fantastical. And I think that's why much of it, I mean, many scenes, especially the really iconic scenes, the dramatic ones like Uther offering surrender when he's got Excalibur drawn out, you see it's like a painting. It's like a classic, really good classic fantasy painting with the composition and the way everything's presented, the lighting, which is hyper sort of fantasy. It's not realistic at all. You know he's pumping light into that scene, and even coloured light to try and paint it like you would paint a fantasy painting.
I think
that's right. In fact, John Boorman said that he wanted to concentrate on the mythic rather than the historic. and that is something that I think is very much brought out in the film, particularly with these scenes that you get this sort of, as you say, it's high art as a film, really.
I think British people, especially me, and Europeans for that matter, have this love of fantasy, mythology, fairy tales, folklore, folk tales. It's like a big part of our culture. And things like Christianity are alien to us. The morals and the principles and the rules and regulations, they're alien to us. This movie taps into that love of folklore, mythology. It didn't connect itself with any modern day politics or some kind of group who's feeling oppressed that month. It never tapped into any of that. It just told a really good fantasy story or a story of mythology, which, even though it's mythology and folklore, it still can give you a good footing in life, a good inspirational thought to walk away from it with.
Although interestingly, Arthurian legend has always reflected the sort of politics and themes and ethics of its own time, and has been reinterpreted with those things in mind. Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regum Britanniae, for example, the Arthurian chapter in there, that is very much to support the Norman conquest of England. So it very much concentrates on the Anglo-Saxons as being the bad guys, and the Norman stroke Breton army that comes back as being a sort of deliverance of Britain, if you like, and to sort of save the Welsh. And you get that very much foregrounded in Antoine Fuqua's, I hope that I've pronounced that correctly, his 2004 version, King Arthur, which you've just mentioned. He more or less concentrates on Geoffrey of Monmouth's version of the Arthurian epic, so that he can talk about things like immigration and things like that. You notice that it's a bunch of sort of immigrants who save the day, and the Anglo-Saxons are evil, and so on. Whereas John Boorman, he looks at reinterpretations mainly of Malory, although he does bring aspects of Tennyson's Idylls of the King in there as well. So Malory's Morte d'Arthur is really the primary text that he and one mustn't forget Roscoe Pallenberg, of course, who had a huge influence on the script and the screenplay and everything, because it was co-written by both Pallenberg and Boorman, and they very much foreground Malory as opposed to someone like Geoffrey of Monmouth, and that concentrates really on the mythic aspects.
I think it was a very good choice of them to deliberately avoid, as a lot of them do, they'll put up a map showing you where it is, and they'll talk about, one group and they'll name them, and another group they'll name them too, sorry. And Boorman, though, chose to display it as the land and the people. They didn't divide Britain up or the various groups within Britain. They just said the land and the people, and they even show it as more like brother against brother, rather than this foreign group causing problems and here's this other group that's going to do something, or reversing it, saying here's a foreign group that's going to save you. It was presented as this sort of out of time, out of the current politics, eternal story in the land with the people.
If you notice some of
the very much. Sorry, can I just add a little quote there that when they sort of gather together in the stone ring, and they say, we have driven the invaders back into the sea. You never know who the invaders are exactly. And, they say the West is free. This is Leodegrance, who's played by Patrick Stewart. The West is free and with us. And so you're right in that it is very vague. Although, interestingly, of course, we're wanting to free the West. And so this can be interpreted in our favor.
And if you noticed that in the movie, you never ever see any battle or any war waged, and at the end they're all happy about it and celebrating victoriously, except for when they battle the forces of evil towards the end. It's almost like they're saying, "Hey, we're going to have fights, but nothing good's going to come out of it if we fight amongst ourselves, and that's not the real enemy." Like the way Braveheart does. Braveheart is a Scottish guy. When I watched it in the early '90s, you almost feel at some points you're actually rooting for English people to be slain by William Wallace. You're behind him and cheering him on, but Excalibur doesn't do that, and I think that's really interesting. It doesn't really take a side and tell you who your enemy is.
Yeah, the warfare, you could see it was been portrayed almost entirely untouched by the post First World War sort of guilt and misery over the result of that. War wasn't seen in the way it has since then. It was definitely harking back to the earlier view of war, which could sometimes be just, could sometimes be glorious, or it just was. It was part of life.
Yeah, there is a certain amount of brutality to it as well, though. I mean, especially in the beginning with Uther. But that, I think, reflects the difference in spirit between Uther and Arthur as well.
Yeah, and there's a lot of battles. There's a lot of battles of minds as well. But in the end, these battles of minds and differences, it doesn't drive them further apart. It brings them closer and closer together. And I don't like the way things like Braveheart and all these other movies make a statement is us fighting amongst ourselves while there's a bigger enemy out there. And I think the Excalibur movie taps into that.
Yeah, the fights in the succession was sort of presented as one thread in story, rather than something coming in and replacing it. I mean, even with Braveheart, it was this lot is going to swamp over this lot. It wasn't presented as, this is one intertwined story, like a rope with one people brought together, and here's some unfortunate conflict between them. While with Excalibur, you could definitely see how it was a deliberate opening straight into the middle of a story. It wasn't presenting, here once upon a time, it's the start of a story. And even the ending followed that same idea, the way it cuts to give it a sort of eternal woven into the fabric of this people's history.
Yeah, it was important to them, and it was a part of their history. It wasn't something to be looked back on with shame or looked back on to say, "Oh, we won that day."
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very true that sort of there's this idea of unity throughout. And it's interesting that, of course, the actions of Uther, even back, right from the beginning of the film, sort of, because he's a force of disunity. Really, he's selfish, and he doesn't act as a king like Arthur does. And this causes the conflict later on, because of course you have Morgana, who is really sort of shaped, I think, by the actions of Uther in the beginning, and she becomes the force of destruction, if you like.
I wonder if either of you two have thoughts on. There was a line from Merlin and from Uther that she had her father's eyes, and I was wondering what your thoughts are on what that might be referring to, because it's too deliberate to come up twice from two different important characters.
Yeah, I think this is the sort of revenge almost of what's he called now? Golwas, I think he's called, isn't he? The Duke of Cornwall, and this is very much his revenge against against the House of Uther, if you like, who basically betrayed him and killed him and so on. And so, although it's not Arthur's fault, of course, but you have this idea that the sins of the father will be invested in the son and all that kind of stuff.
And remember, just before then, there is a scene where Uther's killed and he drives the sword into the stone and says, "None shall wield Excalibur but me." So that must mean that she must see Arthur as him. She must see the same person in both. So that when she says you have his eyes, she means she sees him.
Yeah, very, very much so. And this is something that's missed. A lot of critics really criticize the plot. I don't. I think that the plot is perfectly logical, and I think that the critics just don't get it. Like what's he called, Roger Ebert, who was a very famous critic. He didn't get it at all. But the problem is that he's a liberal, and he's seeing things through liberal eyes. This is an extremely sort of aristocratic vision of things, where as well, the sort of rivalries between ruling dynasties and so on, which were at that time perfectly natural. Like for example, when Arthur draws the sword from the stone, and all of a sudden they separate into two factions just at a blink like that. Well, that's what happened, in the past. And one would go with one group, one would go with the other group, and they would fight against each other. And that's how things were. And they drew up alliances, often on arbitrary things like who could get the most power, or equally on points of religious discourse or or anything like that. And so that is not understood in this day and age almost. And I think that the critics of the film didn't get that at all, that we're looking at the morality of a completely different age.
Even, I seem to remember Roger even went as far to say that the motivations, behaviours made no sense to him at all. But when I was watching it, all of it seemed perfectly understandable. You don't think, every decision was wise, but you understood that the flaws in that person sort of naturally result in those actions. So it surprised me to see, after I watched it, how many of these critics felt that the behaviour was illogical, or it made no sense to them why it would all play out as it did. Yet the story seemed perfectly natural and believable to me, almost more realistic, despite being obviously high fantasy, deliberately avoiding the realism angle as we mentioned. It was still the believable characters and results.
Well, again, as I say, that's really because the critics are liberals, and they're looking at this through sort of bourgeois liberal eyes, and you can't watch the film like that. If you do, then it won't make any sense to you at all. You see, we're all sort of rightists and everything, and this for me is one of the most rightist films of all time. And to us, it makes perfect sense, because what you're looking at is man's the overall arching theme is really the transition from paganism to Christianity and man's move away from nature. And these are huge themes for the right. And so liberals don't really get the film at all, and critics don't understand it, and they don't understand the symbolism and the personifications of characters and so on, because they represent certain things as well as being characters. On one level they are human beings, on another they're representative of certain forces.
Yeah, I've noticed that a lot of people don't see why people from the UK, Europeans like me, I feel connected to the earth, to the forest, and to the mountains, and not in a hippie kind of way. I mean, I really know that's where I belong. That's where my people came from, going back hundreds and hundreds of years. So when I watch this movie and I see that element, how it's nature dying and concrete's taking over, the time of the old ones is gone and the time of the new ways is coming, and it's not necessarily going to be something good. And there's this slow decline after this Christianity theme appears in Excalibur. There's a kind of gradual decline, and it's all a mess towards the end. Everybody dies. Excalibur's thrown back in the lake, and that stands out to me. And that's why it stands out to me, because I feel like I'm connected to the earth, and I can see this happening in my own society, in my own country, this concrete jungle.
Yeah, did you notice, for example, when he draws the sword from the stone, we're in the pagan age. You have druids there with the mistletoe blessing the sword and the stone and the knight and everything as he goes to try and draw it from the stone. Patrick Stewart, of course, nearly ruins the scene with one of the worst pieces of overacting I've ever seen in my life as Sir Leodegrance of Camelyard. But anyway, that and then later projected forward, when we get to the marriage scene, we have a Christian ceremony with the priest and everything, and the sort of that the whole paraphernalia, and then we get the speech, of course, that Merlin gives to Morgana, where he says famously, "The one God comes to drive out the many gods. The spirit of wood and stream grow silent. It is the way of things. Yes, it is a time for men and their ways." And there is an element of regret in there, but of fatalism at the same time. But of course, later on, Merlin disappears because it's no longer his world anymore, because it's no longer the pagan world. And he announces to Arthur that this is the time when you must rule alone. This world is done with me. There are other worlds, and so on, because of course he's a remnant of the pagan world. And you're right that we have from that point decline. And Borman does not like Christianity. I know that for a fact, and has sort of spoken about it in interview. And he and so this and he's very much into nature and that kind of thing. And so you have this idea throughout that the Christian God is anti-nature, which is a very pagan view of things, actually. I mean, I would agree with him there, even though I disagree with Borman on other things and in other films and so on, especially things like Deliverance and The Emerald Forest. But anyway, because I think at times he has a cretinous view of nature. But certainly in this film, he has a very good view of nature and of man living with nature, and Arthur ultimately betrays nature. You'll notice with the lightning scenes as well, there are 2 times that lightning strikes. Can you remember what they are?
Oh, I can't remember. I should remember.
Arthur's, after he runs away with the sword in the dark forest. I remember there's one there.
That's right. That's when Merlin talks about the dragon. And of course, the dragon is the symbol of nature. Now, of course, in Christian symbology, in Christian symbolism, the dragon is the symbol of Satan. Always has been. But yet the dragon here is the symbol of nature. And so this is a sort of very much positing Christianity as being anti-nature. And the other time that lightning strikes, can you remember the next time that lightning strikes?
Not at all.
Nope.
It's
during the wedding?
No, it's when Morgana comes and sleeps with Arthur, and they go and pray in the church, and he's struck by lightning. Now, to me, that is not God striking him down. That is not Yahweh striking him. That is nature striking him.
Yeah.
Because he's abandoned nature.
And if you notice as well, that scene where Liam Neeson's character is on the horseback and he's riding through the slums, and there's people writhing around in the mud, and they're saying how the land's ruined in front of them and they can't grow any crops. Then you think back, well, these guys have been sitting in this castle in this shiny armor, talking about how great everything is, and only now did they realize just how awful it is. And it's awful not because there's no food, but because people have moved away from the forests and away from nature, and they've cut down all the trees and they've ruined their own land because they don't know how to do anything with it. And that's why there's no food. So it's all gone downhill while those guys are living in splendor in a castle made of gold or silver.
Yeah, that's actually not Liam Neeson who's Gawain. It's Percival, that isn't it?
Oh yeah, sorry.
Yeah, Paul Jeffrey. Although that's quite an unknown actor, although a very good one.
And he's the best character in the movie for me. I love how he's always true. He's probably the weakest one of them. He just comes from the land. He's a very simple person, but he's brave. Even though he can't fight, he's brave. He rides that horse really well. You can tell he's got this connection to the earth. And he's the one that goes to the very end. He reaches the edges of death to get the grail for Arthur. Way more than any of the heroic knights have managed to achieve. And I think that's a message in there. If you're connected to the earth and you're connected to where you come from and nature, you will remain true to your roots.
I think it also referred well to the ability to rise up in old European culture. He was somebody who showed ability and the others, and he had to prove himself, but he still managed to rise up from, as you see him in the forest, he looks like the lowest peasant, up to nobility, but through merit.
Yeah.
That's right, and of course, he's the one who saves the king in the end, and saves the land itself, as you've said, Neil, because he comes from the land, and it's something that Arthur has forgotten because it's become too lofty, and he's betrayed nature, of course, and so the Grail here. I mean, what do you think that the Grail represents? Because it, to me, doesn't seem a very Christian idea of the Grail.
There's definitely a pagan feeling to it. It didn't feel like any kind of holy Grail, cup of the carpenter type thing. It seemed to represent. When I saw the scene when he talked about turning to the Grail as a solution, it felt like he was actually looking back to his roots, to the pagan, to think, right, that's what I need to reinvigorate the tree, to water the roots so this can grow again, because he knows he came from the pagan roots with the sword and all the rest of the inheritance.
Yeah, it's interesting actually that during the 1920s and particularly the 30s, especially by the National Socialists, they looked at this idea that the Grail was older than Christianity and that it was pagan. Especially Himmler was interested in that kind of thing. You actually get quite it's very interesting because I mean, just to deviate for a little while and an aside, I mean, the music, you have Richard Wagner and Carl Orff there. I mean, of course, you have Terry Jones who provides the original music, but the music that John Boorman has chosen for the film or from previous composers is Richard Wagner and Carl Orff, who are both associated with National Socialism. I find that extraordinary. One or the other, and you could go, okay, it's not really a coincidence, but the two, and as I say, this for me is one of the rightest films you can possibly imagine. If this was made now, there would be uproar, especially in the casting, which is entirely white.
Well, Morgan Freeman would be Merlin if they were to remake it now.
And Lancelot would, of course, have to be black, cooking the White King or whatever.
And Idris Elba, he would have to be Arthur.
Got to be another candidate.
For Guinevere, I think, what's that girl with the big ass called? Nicki Minaj, yeah, she can be Guinevere, yeah, just to keep the masses happy. There you go.
Smash it. Where's our 100 million, please?
But I think there's another reason for the use of Wagner as well, and that is that Arthurian legend taps into other legends as well that are quintessentially European. So he uses the ring cycle quite a lot, especially Siegfried's funeral march, which is used as a refrain throughout the film. And at the end, of course, there's Siegfried's journey across the Rhine. And it's this idea that there are great similarities in the tragic hero between Arthur and Siegfried, or Sigurd, as he's known in Volsunga Saga, because of course Wagner's ring cycle is taken from two sources really. One is the Volsunga Saga, and the other is the Nibelungenlied. And so in the Volsunga Saga, he's called Sigurd the Dragon Slayer, and in Nibelungenlied he's Siegfried, but it's the same character ultimately. But there are huge similarities between Arthur and between Siegfried as the tragic hero, as I say, and the hero ultimately dies. And also this idea of the transition between the ages of the gods and the age of man as well, which you see as well in the denouement of the ring cycle. So I think that's interesting as well, in that these things are brought together. These sort of these two different epics are brought together through music. So the music of the one sort of taps into the visual aspect of the other. I think that's extremely well done. As well, of course, in when you have the forest scene between Guinevere and Lancelot, the music played there is from Tristan und Isolde by Richard Wagner, and there again you have this sort of this fated love story, and this idea of cuckolding the king as well. Tristan und Isolde is a love story, and King Mark is the cuckold. So again, you have this idea that the music plays one thing, but it has the same themes as what we're seeing in Arthurian legend. And I think that's particularly interesting.
The music in the movie is fantastic, especially the last scene when Percival throws the sword into the lake and you get that pumping anthem. It kind of makes little hairs in your arms stand up on end, because it gives you a glimmer of hope. And it's not often a movie can do that every single time you watch it. It makes your heart beat a little bit faster at the end. It's a fantastic movie for music. Just watch it for the music.
The music was also used quite sparingly, or at least just when it felt like it was right. It wasn't afraid just to have background noise and general, even in a battle scene, it's just as noises of the battle, but it would bring in that music just at the right moment to get that effect you mentioned, Neil.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what would they use now? Probably some generic shite by Hans Zimmer.
And it would probably play through half the film. There'd be just this noise in the background all the time. Like elevator music you tune out.
Yeah, it is true that that music actually makes a film in a way, especially when it's used like that, where it builds to the whole, and and if you kind of know your culture and everything, and this is the thing about the film as well, in that a certain amount of cultural knowledge is expected, and that's again something that the critics did not realize, because of course critics these days are completely uncultured. They have no idea about their own culture, but a certain background knowledge is expected for you to have a deeper understanding of the film. I mean, anyone can watch it, but the more of a deeper understanding of your own culture you have, the more things you can see in this film. It is quite extraordinary, and this is why I think that it really does form a part of high art.
Well, it is a film that doesn't look down on the audience, unlike a lot of modern films which just expect the worst and aim for a lowest common denominator.
Yeah, it's interesting as well that, I mean, going back to Wagner, Wagner had this idea of Gesamtkunstwerk, in other words, a total work of art. And this, for me, is it. Excalibur is a Gesamtkunstwerk. And the other thing about Gesamtkunstwerk is that it had to have nationalistic ideas in it because it came from the soul of a people. And that very, as I say, I think that Borman has done this quite deliberately. If you look at the cast, they're all European. And it speaks to the European soul and imagination. It is a quintessentially Eurocentric film.
It is.
So you notice a couple of points in the film where Arthur falters and also Guinevere in the Knight's Hall and at the round table. In various shots, you'll see a sort of projected cross in the background, a big blue cross. And you'll notice that when Arthur falters around about the duel scene where he sort of betrays Guinevere, or at least she feels betrayed, there's the cross is aligned perfectly above him, as if it was blaming the source of that morality and choice at that moment. And the same scene's repeated almost except Guinevere is sat in that seat. And you realise, of course, that means she'd have to have been sitting in the king's seat, and the king would have to have been moved up one. So it's set up deliberately with her now under the cross. When Merlin turns around and says, when a man lies, he murders some part of the world, and you see Guinevere looking uncomfortable below this big projected cross behind her, as if that's the source of her morality. And of course, Merlin's a representation of the pagan, natural way of morality.
Yeah, very, very much. And you'll notice the use of color schemes. Paganism is all paganism stroke nature, because they're one and the same thing, is always green. And you'll notice how the green glows in the film. It's extraordinary how green is foregrounded. And Christianity, as you say, is represented by blue. So you have the blue cross there. If you look at the blueness in the church as well, in the church scene, and also there is a sort of a blue hue, really given off by the silver armor in the wedding scene as well. So you have that kind of silvery blue kind of hue, and very sort of sparkly and everything, and Excalibur, of course, if you notice, the blade glows green. It always glows green because it's imbued with the power of nature, and in other words, it is a pagan artifact. Of course, Merlin says that that it was forged when the world was new. So by the gods of nature and not by the gods of man, or the god of man in this case. The quotation is interesting as well, that Merlin gives, which you've just mentioned, which I mean, it's when he talks about truth, because of course Arthur asks him, what's the best quality of a knight, and he gives this sort of bullshitty answer about it, they all sort of melt together like the alloys that make a good sword or whatever. And, and Arthur says, no riddles, give it to me straight and everything. And, and he says, all right then, truth. That's it, yes. It must be truth above all. When a man lies, he murders some part of the world. You should know that. And it's very interesting that he's fallen away. Just as he's fallen away from nature, he's also fallen away from the other rightist principle, which is truth. The rightist always believes in truth. If you look at the left, it's entirely built upon lies, and it's built upon deviating away from truth and away from nature, because nature is truth. Nature is that which is given, and this is one of the reasons why it is this is one of the most rightist films ever made. If you look at, for example, a leftist liberal theory like utilitarianism, talking about utilitarianism with a capital U here, as created by Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill's father, James Mill. Utilitarianism is based on the pleasure principle. Now, pleasure, so the greatest pleasure is the greatest good. That means if the greatest good can be achieved through a lie, that is perfectly acceptable. You see, the left has no commitment to truth. And if you look at, things like transsexuality, homosexuality and everything, they're all about people pretending to be things that they're not. One homosexual has to pretend to be a woman, or transsexual has to pretend to be a woman, and so on. It's all, it's all about, and now, of course, we've got sort of this idea that race is a social construct and such bullshit as that. So the left is full of lies, whereas the right, if the right is based on one single principle, it is on truth.
Yeah, because we have to stand by our words. These people on the left seem to say anything these days and hope that people just buy it, just take it. They give it like an easy to swallow formula. If this is like Excalibur was made nowadays and had never been made by John Berman, what would it be like? Think about it that way. You can watch this film and walk away from it with a moral or principle or some kind of mindset that you can benefit from in life if you follow it. Just in the same way you can watch Dark City and walk away with it knowing that you've learned something from it. How many other movies can do that? That will remind you of who you are, where you came from, and what the history of your country is. How are you going to want to defend that if you've got absolutely no appreciation of it?
There was a stylistic choice with it as well. I think stood out well compared to a lot of the modern TV series or Hollywood versions of the King Arthur story. And it's how all the main figures, especially the knights, obviously, the royalty, they stood out right in front of you. But there was scene after scene with commoners, but you almost don't see them. They just fade into the background because they're not actively trying to change the world or do anything. They're just sort of passively living their lives. But you see they just blend into the background, almost like the shrubs, while in a modern one, you'd have to have a cheeky or uppity servant. You'd have to have some plucky underdog come in, but they had a sincere and genuine sort of rising underdog with Percival, but he could display the nobility and the bravery to earn that. While obviously in the Hollywood versions, it tends to be somebody completely undeserving, somebody who has really bad character, who gets this prominent role, and you're meant to sympathise with them because they're the underdog, even though their actions don't then lift them up beyond where they were.
Yeah, and I think a lot of us kind of feel like Percival in a way. Through most of our lives, many times in our lives, we're going to feel like we're at the bottom of the pile. But we are going to get an opportunity, or you do get opportunities to rise from that. And you can't have like a lifestyle where you're going to blame everybody else for your own undoings. And Percival's a good representation of that. If you try hard and you're true to where you are from, where you come from, and who you are, then you can rise up, absolutely. And that doesn't mean that you're going to gain gold or jewels from it. You're going to gain so much more from it on a personal level. And I think that's a good little moral to give to people watching it. And what would the morals of the movie be now? And what group of oppressed people are feeling victimized this month? and who can we attach our politics to sell this movie?
Well, that was a lot of the film itself. You could tell it was true to the story without trying to attach very transient politics. You know, there wasn't any politics of the day attached to that. If it wasn't for the way it was filmed, you know, and you understand the technology behind it, if somebody told you that story, you know it could be an eternal story told 1,000 years ago. While if you watch a lot of the other versions of these or similar sort of rejigged European stories, you can tell they're very much of their time and they date terribly because of it, because it's whatever single issue or one or two issues they wanted to cram in there.
Yeah, I think that you're right. There's not a politics as such, but there is certainly a morality, and it's very much a morality that goes back and goes back a long way, and you know, it's pre-Christian morality. And going back to what you were talking about with Parsifal, he's interesting in that you know, he comes from the background and into the foreground, and is almost you can contrast him with King Arthur, because King Arthur comes from the foreground and drifts into the background. If you notice in around the round table, he starts wearing sort of house clothes, very drab brown house clothes. He dispenses with the armor. All these other knights, they stay in their armor, and that is for me, he's become passive.
He's become like a lazy dad, hasn't he? Just put on the dressing gown.
Yeah, exactly. And he's pretty much given up his role, and you can see Guinevere's point actually, and she sort of you know, when Gawain, you know, makes the claim that she's you know, that she and Lancelot are lovers, and they haven't been lovers until that point. Although they've been in love, they haven't actually done anything, because Lancelot is, you know, he's always been away, and he stayed away quite deliberately, and so they haven't acted upon it. But yet, you know, Gawain sort of accuses the queen, and Arthur backs down from the fight, and he says, "I must be your judge in this," you know, and she you know, and she's obviously quite cheesed off at that, and he says, "I am your king," and she asks, "What before husband?"
She's probably quite angry about him charging, attacking Lancelot.
You can tell the knights are disgusted as well, because the at that point it's also when they start pushing and sort of nipping back, like their sense of weakness in him, and when he's looking for a champion, he's left alone. So that you really get the idea of the wrongness of his choice at that moment.
Yeah, he'll fight for a bridge, but not for his wife.
Yeah, that's right, because, you know, he's fought as king before. So why has this suddenly changed now? He's basically changed the rules, and he's become more passive. And he's become more passive as he's become more Christian. And that is, again, you know, going back to this idea that paganism relies on the heroic ideal for masculinity, but Christianity is very much pacifist. And so he becomes more passive, and he becomes less respected. And of course, his own wife doesn't respect him in the end.
I think the armor motif as well, that Mordred with his golden armor was an interesting choice, because Arthur starts off in black, dark armor, then he goes into this Christianized, but still some noble, but this heavily silvered armor, and then none into these kind of brown, drab clothes. While Mordred comes in with this overly gaudy, very vain, sort of showing a corruption of this, what of the pagan beliefs and the duty of any kind of leader, and of course his behaviour really hammers that home as he goes along. But visually, there's obvious choice to making this sort of pretty boy with this golden armour.
Yeah, the first actor who plays him is actually Charlie Boorman, and that's John Boorman's son, which is funny. But anyway, yeah, you're right. Did you notice who wears the silver armor first?
Lancelot.
Absolutely. So they go to worshipping Lancelot. Lancelot becomes a sort of a Christ-like figure, if you notice.
They said the table was nothing without Lancelot.
Yeah, that's right.
And he gets stabbed in the side with his own sword.
That scene was horrific as he pulls that out. Still stands up.
Well, you notice the sort of allusions to Christ. Christ gets a wound in the side, if you remember.
Yeah.
And he also comes back from the dead, does Lancelot. So he's this... he is this Christ-like figure, and they start worshipping him. And of course, what happens? Well, King Arthur's wife leaves him for this guy who's being worshipped. Why wouldn't she?
What do you mean when King Arthur's got his feet up on the round table with his dressing gown on, and there's a young heroic man out there? Yeah.
Well, exactly, because he's not fulfilling his duty anymore. He's meant to be the leader, and yet he's given Lancelot all. He's basically given Lancelot all his duties and everything, and let him pretty much rule the kingdom in his stead. And he instead, he's sipping a bit of the wine. And and sort of making fun of Merlin, and so on. And Merlin, of course, rightly rebukes him a couple of times, and he still doesn't get it at all.
It's probably a good message just for men in general. I mean, I'm not married, so I can't really speak upon this, but even the simple message in there: keep your wife happy, or she'll run off with a guy with an Audi.
I'm not sure that Lancelot has an Audi. Of course, King Arthur has pretty much everything that he could possibly imagine in terms of material possessions and everything. But what he doesn't have anymore is spirit.
Yeah.
He's given that spirit away.
He's become the heroic figure in our life.
Yeah, Lancelot has become the hero.
Mm-hmm.
And Arthur is no longer heroic.
Lancelot also shows, to some degree, this sort of unrealistic vision of what he can be, the kind of goals he had, in that he says he'll love her and take no other, yet he still expects this to work out all right, him to remain chaste forever and to never be tempted. It's a sort of idealistic but completely wrong view of what people can be. I mean, anybody with a more grounded view would have said, oh, that's not going to work out, you're going to end up cheating with her, that's going to cause a problem. But his sort of, I suppose, him representing the Christian morality and belief in what people can be just didn't work out with what he naturally was and became.
Yeah, do you think he was in there maybe to be Arthur's biggest test? Maybe that was what the real sort of battle was?
I think that's a degree of it. Arthur could have risen up and stood not against him as a foe, but could have risen up to the comparison and the challenge. And likewise, Lancelot wasn't perfect. He could have maybe accepted certain flaws within himself. Or Arthur could have taught, no, you need to also, stop being this, almost like he's acting, well, you'd think of him now as a robot that's just this perfect knight, instead of what he should have done was settling down, have a family, because of course Arthur wasn't doing what comes naturally, which was get a wife, have a family, despite being a knight with wealth.
Yep, and at the end of it, he becomes this wild-haired, big, bushy-bearded warrior with none of his armor left, and he's this old insane guy. he's lost it all. He's lost his beauty. He's lost his money and his prestige, and now he's this weird, wandering hobo, I suppose, religious hobo.
It's a sort of punishment for trying to go against it so hard, nature itself, and trying to, force himself into an impossible mold.
Yeah, and of course he rebukes he rebukes Percival on Christian morals, really. He says that they forgot God and made themselves gods, and so he's very much this sort of symbol of Christianity, if you like. As I said, he's very much a Jesus kind of figure. But equally, he sort of learns humility in the end and everything, and he self-sacrifices for the cause. But he's a very difficult character. In Arthurian legend, in any case, he was always set up as that Jesus kind of figure. He was always set up as some kind of Superman, at the same time as he was also cooking Arthur, because he comes from French literature, and it was the French that invented this character basically to cook the British King Arthur. This is why he was sort of created, because he wasn't created really until the about the 12th century or something like that, maybe later. And he appears quite late, and this is pretty much an attack on our sort of myths and so on. But yet he's become sort of an intrinsic part of Arthurian legend now, interestingly.
The Morgana and Merlin interplay, I think, was really interesting as well. Now, one aspect of it, I don't know what you two might think about it, but Merlin's, he was obviously the sort of pagan roots and spirit, but you could see he was resigned to the change that was coming, but decided to sensibly guide it the best way he could, try and maintain the roots. And he could foresee the future, probably thinking, well, something will grow of it again, things can return. While Morgana was this sort of creature against time, battering herself against the wall of the tide, trying to hold things back, which ultimately destroyed herself, destroyed everything she cared about, and caused all this suffering because she was sort of railing against time, which she can't do. You've got to change with it, even if you're staying true to the origins and the roots, as Merlin would want.
Well, I think the problem with Morgana is really that she's extremely self-centered. She wants power for herself, and that's her character flaw. And again, she's extremely vain and self-centered, and so she, like you see in the end, she's spent all her power on retaining her beauty and her youth, which of course Merlin uses against her in the end. And of course then you have the matricide, which again is sort of this unnatural act. So she has betrayed nature to an extent in that she's tried to cheat nature throughout her life, and she hasn't really understood, as Merlin has, that that you have to let things take their course to an extent, but equally you have to try to sort of push people in the right direction. Ultimately, of course, Merlin fails in that because no one listens to him. Actually, if you read Malory, no one listens to Merlin. He's the wisest guy around, but no one listens to him. It's this is sort of the fate of Merlin, in that he has all this wisdom and everything, and people just treat him as some kind of bumpkin or whatever. So that's very true to the tradition of Arthurian legend. Actually, it's like when they're in the stone ring and they've just beating off the invaders and everything, and they jostle him and everything, and he has to kind of get his stick out and the flame on the stick and go, stand back, that's very much in the character of Merlin. But as I say, you have the contrast between Morgana and Merlin, in that Merlin doesn't really seek for power that much, not in the way that Morgana does. He has power, and he tries to use it to shape things for the best way possible, not for himself, but for everyone.
And if you notice, people in the movie, the Knights of the Round Table, even the enemy armies, they all fear Merlin. I mean, they're under the command of Arthur, and they respect him as king, and they'll fight wars for him. But they're actually scared of Merlin. They don't really see him as one of them. Everyone's equally scared of him, and I think that's a really interesting thing. Even though they're scared of him, they don't see him as a king. They see Arthur as a king. But why do they not see that this thing that embraces everything, that gives advice to their king, that they're all a part of? Why do they walk away from it? Why do they see him as this bumpkin, this silly guy who can conjure spells, when he's much more than that? But they walk away from it. And Morgana walks away from it in a completely new direction. She goes down like a dark path. Arthur just gives up. But either way, they both walk away from him and nature and themselves and who they are.
Yeah, but well, I mean, Merlin, again, going back to the stone circle scene, he says it is the doom of men that they forget.
Yeah.
And this is, this kind of foreshadows everything that's to come. The unity and and the sort of pagan brotherhood that they had and everything, and their relationship to nature, and they forget it all, and they become sort of hedonists, as you can see in Camelot when they're around the round table, and Gawain, he's got this girl on his knee, and a goblet of wine in one hand and everything. And you can see he's pissed out of his mind and everything. And they've forgotten their responsibilities and their duties. Same with Arthur. Arthur forgets his responsibilities and his duties to the kingdom, which is why the land dies and why Guinevere, goes off with another man. And this is what Merlin warned them of. But of course, they don't listen, because people don't listen to wisdom. They never do. It's an eternal truth. Dear oh dear, I've stunned everyone with that.
No. I was just waiting in line. I thought James wanted to go.
So I was thinking,
No, but you're right. It seems to be this thing that we are doing now, especially up here where I'm from. I'm seeing this same gradual collective of people walking away from nature and walking away from who they are, and people moving to the cities, getting big jobs in multicultural cities, far away from where they should be. And that's why I like this movie so much, because it's just a little reminder. And it's amazing that a film can do that. It can take something as small as a movie, and you don't have to sit down and watch this thing for 3.5 hours and be bored out your mind. You will be glued to it, and you can learn from it, and you'll want to watch it again and again.
Yeah, very much so. Have we anything to add on this? I think we're drawing to a close, aren't we?
I think the last thing was the contrast between I can't remember the name of the king that Uther makes peace with at the start.
I think it's called Golwaz, if I remember rightly.
No wonder I couldn't remember it. When he makes peace with him, you see the difference between his court and how obviously the King Arthur's court is done, and the sort of customs that go on inside it. Like right away when the peace is made, Uther and the can't remember the name again. The rival. They do the Blood Brothers pact, which you never see again. They both cut their wrists and hold it up, as if this is the real bond between them. This is what really seals the deal. And then you get the festivities and the dancing, which it's interesting that never comes up again in the film, because it's like they've moved on from this stage or changed their customs.
Yeah, it's very much a move from sort of brutality towards civilization. That is another one of the progressions that you have in the film. But as you can see, it's not all for the best, because civilization tends to corrupt people. And there's this saying that keeps, this meme that keeps appearing around the internet, that hard times calls for strong men. Strong men create good times. Good times create weak men, and or something along those lines. And this is absolutely true. And you have this in the film, in that you go from men who are extremely strong and strong-willed and everything, and they become corrupted by ease and leisure. And that again is an eternal truth, and it's something that we on the right talk about quite a lot. And again, I've stunned everyone. So unless there are any last thoughts, we should probably end it with that.
Yeah, go and see Excalibur.
Yeah, it's a very good film. It's an eternal film in the sense that a great painting can be an eternal painting.
And remember that comfort and ease is not the best thing in the world. That heroism, leading a heroic life, and being able to look yourself in the mirror each day is far better than living in the lap of luxury. I'm David Yorkshire, editor of Mjolnir magazine, saying goodbye. And with me are
Neil Westwood. Goodbye.
And
James. Goodbye.
Goodbye, and we hope to see you for the next episode. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.